Yeah, I'm Doug Wahlsten. I'm professor emeritus at the University of Alberta. Well, I'm technically retired, but for me, I'm still writing scientific papers based on data that we collected from my lab. I'm working on a couple of books. I've started doing some creative writing, and I'm a photographer. I've had 4 shows this year so far of my photographs on Salt Spring Island. And I'm a runner. And in fact, I'm training right now for a race that's going to be here in Victoria. I grew up in the Midwest of the United States. My parents, actually, they were both college educated, but not really intellectuals. I had 2 sisters and a brother, and basically a pretty normal house in the suburbs. My dad worked, he worked for Chrysler, and my mother took care of us at home, and she's also an organist for a church. I came to Alberta in 1988. 1988. I had been at the University of Waterloo. See, I moved from the United States up to Canada and became a professor there. And then my spouse was offered a job at the University of Alberta, and they ended up hiring us both, so we moved west. My bachelor's degree is in physics. Then I did a PhD in behavioral psychology, and then I did a postdoctoral studies in genetics. And then I got into neuroscience, so that my field became the genetics of brain defects and behavior. And I also became very interested in the history of behavioral genetics, especially in relation to IQ testing and things of that nature. The main thing that I spent years on is we discovered an abnormality of the brain. There's a bundle of fibers that connect the 2 cerebral hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. And I discovered some strains of mice that lacked this structure altogether. So we did a long series of investigations to find out what went wrong, what the consequences were for their behaviors, and things of that nature. So I was doing a lot of anatomical studies, sort of hard science, and then also studying their behavior, how they learn, anxiety, testing a whole variety of behaviors in mice, hoping to find something that might serve as a useful model for certain human conditions. You're not going to find a mouse that exactly mimics a human condition. But there are a couple of mice that some people claim can model some aspects of autistic spectrum disorder. But there are some much better models right now. You can they have inserted the Huntington disease gene from a human that had Huntington into a mouse. And the mouse, in fact, then will develop neurological symptoms. And then they're using that to study how it develops and how to prevent it, etc. I know exactly how it's really burned in up here. It was very vivid. When I moved to the University of Alberta and I entered the psychology department, I had no idea that there'd been a eugenics program here. I knew about eugenics. I'd read several books that especially talked about the history of it in the United States, but I didn't know about it. And it turned out that my department was the department founded by the man who was the chair of the eugenics board for a long time, but I didn't know that. So one day I was teaching behavior genetics to undergraduates, about 100 students, and I was lecturing on the genetics of intelligence. And I mentioned in passing about how some people had advocated sterilizing those with low IQ. After class, a young man named Colin came up to me, and he said his girlfriend's mother was preparing a lawsuit at that time, and he told me her name. And it was Sandra Anderson. So I got in touch with Sandra, and we met for coffee, and then she told me what had happened. which I was just floored. And then I invited her to come to my class, and she actually lectured to my behavior genetics class and told the whole story to us at that time. Well, that would have been in 1994. It was because the trial started the next year. And she introduced me to Leilani before the trial. So I had met her, didn't get to know her much, but then I attended the trial many of the days of it. Once I learned about this, I then talked to some of my colleagues in the psychology department, and the ones that were sort of my friends and all, they didn't know. Like, a lot of people were really surprised. I'm certain that some of the old guard must have known, but by then they were laying low. You know, it wasn't something people were proud of, that's for sure. Well, I mean, I was shocked, because I had the view that Canada generally was a much more progressive place than the United States, and more respect for human rights and so on and so forth. But then I began to realize that Alberta, in many ways, had a lot more in common with the US than it did with parts of Canada. And of course, the eugenics program occurred under the rule of social credit, which was a bit of an anachronism, really. It was out of step with a lot of the rest of Canada, even with Saskatchewan. So I was really, I was shocked that it had happened here. At the same time, I had studied the history of the eugenics movement and knew very well that there were a lot of people that were eager to use this for, really for political purposes. There was never any science behind this, really. The science was used as propaganda to get sort of public acceptance or whatever. They never applied the science that existed for this purpose. None of the eugenics programs did. If you read the various histories that have been written about this, and there's some good ones out there, none of these eugenics boards in the States or in Canada actually recruited leading geneticists to advise them on how to implement a scientific program of eugenic sterilization. Because if they had, they would have been told that this is not going to do anything beneficial for anybody. Eugenic sterilization, it's based on basically what is done selective breeding in agriculture. And you know, a lot of people know about how you breed new strains of farm animals. You choose those that have this quality that you would like, and you breed the male and female together, and then you do the same thing the next generation, and after a while, you can produce a new strain of hog or corn or whatever it might be. So how this is done is pretty well known. So this would be, the thing is that that kind of selective breeding it's done in a controlled way, and it's fairly extreme. You only let a very few of the chosen, the ones with the chosen characteristic, breed. And the rest of them, where the flock of chickens or whatever, they don't. So to make it actually work, you would have to allow less than, say, 10% of the population to reproduce. You'd have to have a massive prohibition of reproduction by almost everybody in that population. And that's what's done in agriculture. And because of that, you can get some substantial changes in things like color, you know, strain of a flower or something like that. You can make some big changes. Just taking the very lowest scoring people, say the lowest 1 or 2%, and preventing them from reproducing, it's going to do almost nothing for the population as a whole. First of all, because IQ itself is not hereditary in the way that we think of certain things like albinism or whatever being hereditary. It just isn't. And they were just dealing with a very small number of people. So I actually did the calculation myself, partly out of curiosity, to see using the science that we have available, how much the Alberta program would have changed the IQ, the mean IQ of Alberta. And I figured out that in about 20 years, it would increase it by 0.04 IQ points. In other words, nothing. It would have no effect, scientifically. Well, they had certain things listed on there. Let's take one, Huntington disease. I believe that was listed in the Sexual Sterilization Act as a cause for sterilization. Well, okay, Huntington disease, yeah, it's hereditary. If a parent has it, on average, half of their children will show it, sort of like a coin flip. The problem, Huntington disease, typically the symptoms show up when somebody's in their 40s or 50s. So usually they've already had children. So the thing of having it in the law was of no real effect. You would have to, if you wanted to get rid of Huntington disease, you'd have to find out who carried it before childbearing age. And that wasn't done. So really, I think they put it in the act to make it look like, some of this really had a scientific basis, because Huntington disease is hereditary, whereas intelligence isn't in any simple way. And again, epilepsy is one of those things where there are forms of it that are hereditary, but there's other causes of epilepsy that have nothing to do with a genetic defect. And so a lot of this, like I say, it did not have a solid scientific basis. As far as I know, they never really went to the science, the expertise that was available in Canada at that time and asked for advice on how to do this. When you look at the leading geneticists that actually studied the genetics of human populations, people like J.B.S. Haldane, he actually was responsible for discovering a lot of the valid laws of the inheritance of characteristics in populations. He was opposed to this. He actually wrote against eugenics. Lancelot Hogben, R.A. Fisher really was not an enthusiastic supporter either. So, but you could look around, you could find people, but I must say that by the time I entered the field, the real hardcore genetic determinists that promoted this kind of thing, I would say were not good geneticists. There were some psychologists that were promoting this, a fellow like Arthur Jensen, but he really didn't understand genetics. He just believed, as a matter of faith, that intelligence is mainly genetically determined. So it was a political thing. There really was never a scientific basis for the Alberta eugenic sterilization program, and for a couple of reasons. One, there was never any evidence that the specific people that they singled out for sterilization had anything wrong with their heredity. Some of them didn't do very well on certain IQ tests and that sort of thing. But it's been known for a long time that you can have, if you have somebody who's mentally deficient and they have a child, quite often the child is normal. And then many mentally deficient children are the offspring of normal parents. And a good example of that in the provincial training school at Red Deer was a fellow named Keith Manning. He was the son of Ernest Manning, the Premier of Alberta. And he was mentally deficient. He was Preston Manning's brother. So, mental deficiency, it has many possible causes. Sometimes there's a shortage of oxygen at birth. If the mother drank too much during pregnancy, there's many, many ways to end up with a bit of an impairment of your mental functioning. And many of these have nothing to do with heredity. It was very well known about the actual family aspect of it, that this was a matter of probabilities, that it wasn't certainty at all. And intelligence, at that time, nobody could, in general, point to specific genes that were defective. And even today, if you look at children that are mentally deficient, in most cases, there's no known genetic deficit in those kids that can be identified that is passed across generations. That's still the case, even with the powerful tools we have now. Intelligence is a very, very complex trait with multiple causes, basically. There's one that really, really struck me when I read more about some of these cases. I had an opportunity to read the files of about 20 of these people that were sterilized. I was recruited to be an expert witness in a second trial. So I was able to look at these in great detail. And the thing that really struck me is the extent to which the Eugenics Board completely ignored the environmental background of these children. You read through these files, and many of them came from extremely, not just impoverished, but abusive and grossly deficient homes. And then they would bring them to this training school and give them an IQ test. And if it was low, they would say that was because of their heredity. They ignored these grotesque examples of impoverished environment. They just wrote that off as though it didn't matter a whit. It was right, it was very, very clear. And even in the case of Leilani Muir, there were social workers that had made comments that ended up in her file and came to light at trial, indicating that the home environment was not a good one. She would go home on so-called holidays from the institution and come back weighing 10 pounds less, you know, with scars on her body. She was abused. But Levan, the director of the school, the home, and McEachran, the chair of the board, and all the so-called psychologist, they just dismissed all of that and attributed all of the problems that they saw in these children to a defect of heredity. So they had real evidence before them of extremely poor environments. They ignored that. They had no evidence of anything wrong with these children's heredity, and yet they concluded that that was why these kids didn't do that well on an IQ test. Well, I met Leilani before the trial, after I met her lawyer, Sandra Anderson. And I talked with Sandra. Sandra filled me in at what had happened in Alberta, and then she asked me, would I like to meet Leilani? So of course, yes, I would like to. And that was really an eye-opener too, because I sort of, after hearing what Sandra had told me and told my class, it was obvious to me there had been an injustice. But when I met Leilani, I mean, it was instantly obvious. You know, she was no moron. She was sharp. She could carry on a conversation. You know, she had a sense of humor. You know, they really had made a big mistake here. They also made a mistake because they did this to somebody that was pretty determined to see justice done. I mean, she deserves a tremendous amount of credit for taking this to trial. And otherwise, none of us would have ever found out about it, really. So it did a great service, I think. But that was it. As soon as I met her, it was obvious that she was mentally normal. Well, we're friends now. I've worked with her. In fact, I worked with her on her book for 18 years. I got to know her pretty well. So I just saw her last in May. She's really a very warm and caring person. She loves children, she loves animals. She can't do enough for them. She probably even goes overboard in spoiling them. She's someone, it is tragic because she's the kind of person who, more than anything in life, she wanted to be a mother. She wanted to have a family. That really, and we all know people like that, she never really aspired to have a career or anything like that. She really wanted to have a family of her own. And that still hangs over her in a very heavy way. So it affects her every day. As she gets older, she has some health problems. You know, life is a struggle for her. She doesn't have a family to help her. You know, she's sort of on her own. So she copes. She's hardworking. She has worked her whole life, and she's even working now. It's amazing. Just recently, she took a job as a waitress in the town where she's living in Alberta now. You know, but she's 68 years old and has health problems, but she's a very tough person. The title is A Whisper Past, and then the subtitle is, you know, Childless After Eugenic Sterilization in Alberta. This book, she had started writing on this before her trial. So when I first met her, she had already written about 50 pages, handwritten. And I looked at this, and then I attended the trial, and I believed that this was a really important thing to make available to the public, and I helped her then to get this book into the final shape, because what it offers, it's her life story, but it has an insider's view of this provincial training school. See, she never should have been in there. She was mentally normal. She never should have been institutionalized. So here they had somebody in this training school who was mentally normal, who later then, when she got out, is able to tell us what life was like. So this is a first-hand account of how she ended up in the institution, what life was like in the institution, what her experience of being sterilized was like, all of her travails in discovering that she had been sterilized. See, they never told her. She found out after she was out of the institution and she got married and they tried to have kids. That's when she found out she'd been sterilized, because she couldn't have kids. And then she went through a real struggle to try and get the operation reversed. So all of this is in that book. Right up, and the book goes right up till recent times when she was, Anna Maria Tremonti on her CBC program, The Current, designated her a game changer. And she was interviewed quite recently. I think that was 2 years ago. So that's in the book too. So it's literally got her entire life story, all of the challenges she faced, the story of the trial, detailed information about the trial. That book now is the best source right now on this sterilization in Alberta. There's lots of quotes from the transcripts of the trial. So it's historically accurate, and yet it also has it's also her personal story. It's the first-hand, first-person testimony of a victim, and someone who, in a sense, overcame the harm that was done to her, even though it's with her to this day. I think it's a very inspiring thing, because she really went through a great many very, very difficult episodes in her young life, and yet she rose above this. She managed to sue the government, which is a very difficult thing in itself, win, become a public speaker, She speaks to various organizations today in Alberta, trying to inspire other people, disabled people, to fight for their rights and their dignity. So she's devoted herself to helping other people. And I think that this is a real, it's quite a story. It's quite a very touching story, really, when you consider what she went through. And yet she has ended up contributing so much. So I think it's of great value, but it's, because it's in her voice. These are her words. Oh, absolutely. Like I say, when we first found out about it, most of my colleagues in psychology didn't know. And in fact, the man who founded that psychology department, he also was the chair of the eugenics board. That history had all sort of been buried. And people just didn't mention. When I was hired, nobody ever said anything to me about that. It was something that I guess they were a bit embarrassed about. So generally, this was not known. There was a lot more information and a lot more knowledge about it in the United States. There was a number of things written. Stephen Jay Gould was a really first-rate science writer and a scientist himself. And he wrote a number of quite popular books, really. There was one, The Mismeasure of Man, that had a lot of information about the history of eugenics and the misuse of IQ tests and that sort of thing. But it was all about the United States. Well, I'll tell you one thing that I'm quite sure is hidden with regard to eugenics in Alberta. And somebody really should, a journalist, somebody should dig into this, because one of the things that struck me as odd as I became more and more familiar with what happened at this training school, the act said that you could sterilize someone if they were about to be released into the community. That was kind of the idea behind it, so they wouldn't go out and then have children. The actual policy was that when a girl at the provincial training school began to menstruate, they would schedule her for sterilization, even if they weren't going to discharge her. Why is that? And that always struck me as odd, but I began to hear some stories that there could very well have been sexual abuse taking place at the provincial training school. And in fact, in May, when we had the book launch, there were a couple of former inmates, and I talked to them, and one of them now has confirmed to me that there was sexual abuse. Some of the interns, the orderlies, the staff members sometimes would take their liberties with some of these children. And what occurred to me was that possibly they were having these sterilization operations on some of these girls so they couldn't get pregnant. So that's somewhat speculative, but it fits with some of the facts that are there. And some of these children, in fact, this one person that I talked with admitted that he, in fact, was involved. Some of this had happened to him, and that he knew other people where this had happened too. So I suspect that there are other cases of this, but it's the kind of thing that there's such shame attached to it. The victims, somehow they don't want to come forward with that. They've had enough stigmatizing without also being, having that on their record, as it were, even though they were children. Of course, it wouldn't be their fault. So that's something that I think it would be interesting to talk more about that. Yeah, Margaret Thompson. Yeah, she was a medical geneticist, a professor at the University of Toronto, and she in fact published a book on medical genetics. So you would, of course, she is familiar with some of the basic ideas in genetics. She then was appointed, she became a faculty member at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Medicine, and at that time, I think that was around 1960, she was appointed to the eugenics board and joined with the others in reviewing cases and approving them. She claimed in her book and at trial that heredity was, as she put it, the overwhelming factor in intelligence. Now, she wasn't able to actually cite a lot of scientific studies that showed that, but this was certainly her belief. So she was an enthusiastic supporter. Even at trial in 1995, she never backed down from the eugenics program. But she defended some practices that many people saw as abhorrent, including the sterilization of Down syndrome boys, not just the sterilization, but the removal of a testicle from some of these boys in an operation that was not medically necessary because they were sterile anyway. And it even said that in her book. So, but she thought that wasn't so bad to subject them to an unnecessary surgical operation. So the issue in that case, it wasn't just a scientific issue, it was an ethical issue. It was an issue of the human rights, the dignity of these people. And something that I noticed, certainly this was true of Levan, the director of the Provincial Training School, he stated outright that these children that he saw as mentally defective, that they really were not fully human. And I think that's one of the fundamental flaws in the whole eugenics program, that they, like Down himself, Dr. Down, after whom Down syndrome is named, he stated quite clearly that it was, these children with Down syndrome were like a different species, that he thought they weren't really human. So, and of course we know now from modern eugenics that these people are fully human. They just have a very small, in some cases, a very small defect in some of the hereditary material, but everything else about them is totally human. But this is how they were viewed. And it's archaic. Certainly the university does. I mean, Dr. McEachran, you know, he was a leading professor at the University of Alberta, you know, the founder of the philosophy department, the psychology department, on lots of committees at the university and so on. And yeah, the provost. I mean, he was a leading light at the university. So they knew very well what he was doing. So, you know, the people that had really authority, that were in positions of authority, had this knowledge. And he had written some things about the eugenics program and this sort of thing. Margaret Thompson, like you say, she was a professor, and it was her position in both cases. It was their positions at the university. So it sort of gave them some standing to be part of that eugenics board. So I would say the university has a considerable responsibility, and that they should have taken some action at the time of the trial. I don't know the extent to which the administrators prior to that trial knew about that history. That, as far as I know, nobody ever really looked into that. That would have been a very interesting thing to do at the time. Not at all. I mean, I think it would be a very helpful thing, just to put the weight, the prestige of the university against these past practices. It would be almost costless to make a statement like that and make it clear to everybody And the reason, part of the reason for this is that there are still people, there have been a couple of books recently written about eugenics and the history of eugenics, where they have suggested that by today's standards, okay, we all admit now that this was a mistake, it wasn't justifiable, and so on, but they claim that in the 1950s, that it wasn't so bad, and that the people that were implementing the eugenics program were good people, sincere people, well-meaning people, etc. And I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that the facts, the historical facts, support that. Madam Justice Veit at Leilani's trial said that she was shocked and offended by the conduct, the disrespectful conduct of the eugenics board. So if the university were to take a stand, a public stand on this, I think it would help to counteract this wrong idea that the people that were implementing the eugenics program in the 1950s were good, sincere, well-meaning, fair-minded people. I don't believe they were. I think they were ignorant. North Carolina had a major program, and I knew about that when I moved down there in 2008. I was a professor there for a couple of years. And so it was known by then that they had that program. But the first thing I found out, it surprised me a bit, but a woman who had been sterilized, she actually sued the state of North Carolina for damages because of her sterilization. She was black. And they held a jury trial, and she lost. So she got nothing. Then there were people making an issue of this politically. This was around the time when Barack Obama was elected president. So it was a politically current issue. And there were people that wanted compensation. They set up a commission. Initially, the government said no way. And it went back and forth. I had moved back to Canada by the time finally they did offer compensation. They had an act, and I think that each person got $20,000 or something like that, some small amount of money. So they, it was a minor, they treated it as a very minor thing. If you look at damages somebody might get in an auto accident or something, you know, like it would be far more than this token payment that was made, but there was something made. But it didn't really help the situation of these people. I mean, it's appalling because forced sterilization was condemned at the Nuremberg war crime trials as a crime against humanity. There's nothing, this isn't something that's not very clearly understood. There's a very clear, internationally recognized rule against such a thing, against a forced operation that is not for the good of the person receiving the medical procedure. It's not just unethical. It's not just a crime, really. I mean, it's a crime against humanity. That is how, that was the judgment at Nuremberg on this matter. And that's why what happened in Alberta was, I think, an extremely grave offense against these children. And to have this happening now in California it's a terrible thing. So, I mean, when you look at how we as researchers, the sort of ethical standards that we try to abide by these days, and the respect for the dignity and the human rights of the people that are in our experiments, you know, this is setting a high standard. But then you have prisoners who suddenly are treated again as really no longer human. Their human rights seem to be just tossed out the window if they can then have a surgical operation forced on them? It's an outrage. As you know, there are various pressures brought to bear on some of the disabled in our society today to prevent them from having children. It might not be sterilization. There are other ways, sometimes keeping people apart, just denying them opportunities and all, that all have the effect of preventing them from becoming parents. But the surgical sterilization is one that clearly was condemned. There's no question about it. Leilani Muir, as we know, won her lawsuit. And there was jubilation when she won. There was a big press conference. The National Film Board did a documentary about it. So the news was really out. And the fact that she received quite a large settlement also was widely publicized. At that time, then, a large number of former inmates of the provincial training school came forward and said they would like to also sue the government. And a new lawsuit was begun. It ended up, there were several lawyers that represented various people. It went through several phases, but I got involved in this because I was retained by the plaintiffs in their lawsuit against the government to serve as an expert witness because of my expertise in genetics and psychology. And that's how I got to see all these files. What they asked me did the eugenics board at the time, like in the 1950s and 60s, conduct itself in accord with the knowledge that was available at the time? Not by today's standards and today's knowledge, but by what was there at that time. And that I had to study because I didn't really know, but I did look into that, and it turned out to be fascinating. And I found, I set a stand, myself, I proposed a standard. How much knowledge should they have known? So I proposed the standard that the members of the eugenics board that were making these decisions should at least have known or had knowledge similar to what an undergraduate student at the University of Alberta at that time in agricultural science, genetics, and psychology would have had. So I went and found all the textbooks that they used at the time and looked up some of the literature, the evidence about environment and intelligence and that sort of thing that was available in the 1950s. And I concluded that, in fact, the eugenics board did not take into account the knowledge that was available at that time. And if they had, it would have made it clear that their entire program was scientifically baseless. So, and I wrote a report to that effect. There were other expert witnesses that wrote reports. There were examinations for discovery. All of this was put together, and eventually the entire case was settled out of court. I believe that these plaintiffs did not get as large an award as Leilani did, but they did get some substantial damages. Part of the reason for that, my understanding, is that many of these people, at that time, their families didn't know that they had even been in the institute. A lot of people didn't want it known that they had been there. And if they had gone to trial, they would have had to get up on the stand, like Leilani did, and tell the world, and everybody would have known. So there was a, when you have an out-of-court settlement, it's like you sort of have a compromise. So for a smaller award than she got, people didn't have to face the rigors of themselves going on the stand, being cross-examined. At the same time, I believe that when and this is just my belief, I don't have direct evidence, that when the government looked at these expert reports, I think it would have been clear to them that they were going to lose. Because by then, like the information I dug up, it did not come out at Leilani's trial. And it made the government and its agents look pretty bad. I looked at reports, the actual files of some of these children who were later sterilized. And in these files, there were some amazing letters from social workers, the RCMP. They would visit the homes of these children and write up a report. And that was made available to the institution and to the eugenics board. And I remember one, it really stuck in my mind, and this really should be made publicly available, taking out the individual information. But this officer said that this was the worst home situation he had ever seen in his entire career. You had this mother and father. The mother was psychotic. They had, I believe it was 9 children in a one-room shack with a dirt floor in a small town north of Alberta. And the parents spoke Ukrainian. And so eventually they seized these children, and 2 of them ended up in the provincial training school, and they gave them an IQ test. And one in particular didn't do very well, and they saw that as indicative of heredity. Well, you look at this horrid situation that they came from. I think it would be good if people, if scholars and journalists could actually see these words. It's stunning to read a report like that that spells out in black and white the kind of thing that this child actually had gone through, that could very easily, explain any kind of intellectual deficit that the person showed. I mean, my God, any psychologist that had the most basic knowledge about child development would immediately see that we cannot assign any problem that this child has to heredity when you have this kind of egregious environmental deprivation and abuse in her background. So I think there's something very powerful to see the actual original documents in the words of the ordinary people that were living in that area, doing their job. They didn't know there was ever going to be a lawsuit. They didn't know these people were going to be sterilized. And I found it very, very, very startling and indecisive. So I think this kind of information should be made available. In Leilani's case, it was. But some of this other could be, at the same time, respecting the rights to privacy of the people that have already suffered so much that we don't want to put them through anymore. I think it's possible to do a service to scholarship and to history while protecting these individuals.